further turmoil within its own country, therefore creating more harm to the people living in that country. This is the clear stance that we opening government is standing for in this debate. We believe that when we talk about the stability, what kind of country that we want to talk about in this debate, first of all, we are not really talking about countries which have a major political upheaval already, and therefore already the stability has been broken down. For example, the cases like Syria, for example, cases like Rwanda, where there already existed a major turmoil within the country despite no kind of intervention of the West has existed. Within those kind of scenario, there doesn't exist a mutual exclusivity between the stability and the intervention of the West, and we think in those kind of scenario, this debate is not really taking a place upon. But furthermore, now what do we mean by prioritizing the stability over the democracy? We believe that yes, the West shouldn't put a sanction in terms of economy, in terms of diplomacy, simply to the country just because that country is not in the political system of democracy to begin with. For example, like countries like Iran, which is like taking maybe a theocratic regime, but not necessarily a rogue nation to begin with. No, thank you, sir. So, furthermore, we believe that also this debate should not be about whether the democracy is an absolute good or absolutely good or not, because we are not really talking about those kind of absolute scenarios, but rather it's highly dependent upon the context where we are having the debate in terms of what's going to be best for the people who are living in this region, for this region itself. We think it's not really about debate of whether the democracy is absolute good or not. So thank you, sir. So, having said that, we are mainly going to bring you three arguments as the opening government. First, we are going to prove to you that first, why is it harder to bring hard to bring a peace or democracy to this region by Western intervention in order to push for the democracy, and why is it highly irresponsible action of the West to begin with. But second of all, we are also going to prove to you that why this kind of sanction upon in terms of diplomatic or in the economy upon non-democratic nations are actually causing more human sufferings or much people's unhappiness within this region. But furthermore, we are also going to prove to you why this kind of pushing for democracy actually contains a perverse incentive for the Western liberal democracies, and is not in any way respecting the sovereignty of this nation, and therefore it cannot be justified in any means. But before I move on, any clarification?
Yes. Do you support the economic sanctions against people like Putin?
First of all, we believe that as we told you, in our criteria that where there already doesn't exist a major political upheaval, and if that country is stable enough so that people are having their own ordinary life, we don't think that we should actually sanction upon in those kind of scenario. We don't think that is the case. First things first, why is it harder to bring democracy to this nation, and why is it highly irresponsible action of the West to begin with? First of all, we think if there isn't a people's necessity or people's need for the democracy already existing in this nation, but rather the external forces trying to bring upon the democracy to this nation, we think it's inevitably going to lead to the power struggle between the regional power, to where the power already existing within the domestic arena, usually brings a scenario of the turmoil of the civil war to begin with. Because we indeed believe that those kind of power struggle maybe in the course when they're trying to get a power, but what we have observed from the past scenarios is the West is most likely to pull out from those nations and doing an irresponsible actions, right? Because we indeed recognize that this kind of Western nations are based their idea upon the political capital the people support within their own domestic nation. Oftentimes, the domestic nation, domestic people, domestic politics, not preferring further intervention or not preferring giving a humanitarian aid to this kind of countries because it is directly not really meeting with their own demand. We think in those kind of scenarios, there's going to be a substantial crisis such as civil war or such as more kind of ethnic cleansing happening, because when in the course of that, West is supported for one faction among that country, and therefore once they pull out, it leads to major problems such as there already exists anti-sentiment existing between different factions leading to the civil war innately. We think in those kind of scenarios, the Western pushing for the democracy is highly irresponsible action as a whole. But secondly, in the counter narrative, what we are actually supporting for in this debate is one, we believe that in order to maintain a further peace and actually for the people as a whole, maybe sometimes having a trade-off between democracy and stability might be necessary. For example, when you're trying to have a power sharing with your already existing dictatorial regime in order to gain a stability within that region, which has actually happened in Tunisia and actually resulted in a pretty good scenario. We think in those kind of cases, stability is the one which can actually guarantee a better scenario for people, but also for the better peace in this region. So thank you, sir. But now, secondly, then why is this kind of pushing for the democracy further causes a human suffering within this region? Because we have told you, even if in the kind of very peaceful, even if in the country where the citizen can have an ordinary life within their daily lives, they are putting upon a diplomatic or economic sanction upon these countries. What's more likely to happen in cases like Iran is that people who are supposed to get a much better life are really not deserving that right to begin with because of the economic sanction that has been put upon by Western liberal democracies. Not saying that we are no longer going to trade with you because you are the one who is undemocratic. But we don't think, first of all, there is no actor, like especially the Western liberal democracy, to say that democracy is a fundamental need for you once you are harming the stability of the region to begin with, because we believe that stability is indeed a more core and more basic right that you deserve as a human. Because you cannot really say as a West, just because of democracy, you deserve to live in a war-torn country can ever stand in those kind of justification. And we believe that if that harms the stability, if that causes further economic hardness within their own country, we don't think that is a just way for this kind of Western liberal democracy to push upon. But furthermore, we also believe that democracy can never be achieved without the stability itself. Once you want to have sustainability, because people need a more stable structure, and their dire need or more basic needs need to be met before they are willing to have a political discourse or economic discourse regarding their own life. Within those kind of scenarios, indeed stability needs to be prioritized for the people living in that country, even in the short term and also in the long term. And we believe that that is the way where the West should push their foreign policy for. And we believe that yes, the current policy that the West has been done in terms of pushing for democracy has done an irresponsible action to this country. It's time for them to push for stability instead of democracy under the name of instead of pushing the neo-colonialism in this scenario. Thank you.
Just leave it on. It's on now.
All right, right.
Yeah.
I thank the Prime Minister for their speech. Welcome the opposition leader to begin their team's case.
Honorable panel, what our burden is not, is that we defend exporting democracy everywhere and every time. We will not prove to you that it is absolutely necessary to do it every time and every single where. What we do want to tell you is that we want stability as well, but we want it through democracy and through a long-term stability rather than a short-term of which government speaks of. Moreover, we tell you that we are prone to accept that the democracy is the best option for the people when it comes to criteria of what is the best for the people. First off, couple of points of refutation. A, we get no analysis from the OG. What does the stability mean? We never hear from them in any single sentence of analysis on what does the stability means. Second thing is that what we tell you is that those countries of which they speak are more prone to have corrupted governments, to have autocratic governments who are controlling people. Now, what does that mean? A, your freedom of movement, your freedom of speech are limited. You can't necessarily say what you want. Secondarily, propaganda is controlled by the state. All the movements, all the freedoms are most likely to be restricted by the militia or by the military forces within that state, focusing all their power through an autocratic regime. We tell you that all of those things are extremely harmful for the people of these states. Moreover, we tell you that in that situation, we don't accept that stability. Moreover, we tell you that when they come up and tell us, like, the civil wars and bringing the peace and all those things might be problematic due to civil war, more and ethnic cleansing, we tell you that that already exists. The government is controlling their people, and we don't see necessarily the stability nor the ethnical freedoms for the people. Moreover, we are more prone to believe that autocratic regimes are more prone to be discriminatory towards different ethnicities. Moreover, we tell you that if the civil war is imminent, we tell you that it will happen regardless of of our intervention. More, we tell you that when it comes to civil war, it is highly important that we actually support those, because all the movements that try to gather themselves against the government that is autocratic, that they don't necessarily want, we tell you that in that sense it is crucial for us to support them. Due to the people's will to change from the autocratic regime to the democracy, we see the necessity for us to help them. And yeah, coming into some of the constructive. A, we're going to talk to you about why this is the long-term solution and how democracy is actually more beneficial for those people. B, we're going to talk about the moral duty of the Western countries to actually do this. Coming into the why it is long-termly good. A, we tell you that most of the countries in the world have changed from autocratic regimes to democratic regimes at some period of time. We tell you that with the help, it is much better. We also tell you that if it's done sooner than later, we are more prone to believe that the transition period, which is highly problematic for every single state, is much better to be done earlier. Now, coming into why it is better. A, we do want stability. We want it only through the idea of democracy. Now, why is democracy better for every single state? A, we tell you that people have more freedoms. Secondarily, people have some influence on who governs them, what policies are done. We tell you that within democracy, we're more prone to believe that people can, to some extent at least, control their governments rather than in the autocratic regimes. Moreover, we tell you that most of the influences coming from the West can help them progress on a social, economic level. Also political level. We tell you that all of those things are beneficial for the society as a whole. Moreover, we tell you that if every single state is prone to at some point go from autocratic to democratic regimes, we tell you that the help of the West is absolutely necessary. Why? Transition period is not easy period. You need, first of all, we tell you that a lack of a political education that happens under the autocratic regimes tend to keep the people not interested in democracies, thinking it's everything the best. We tell you that all those influences that might come from the West are more prone to help them actually realize that democracy is left to the people to decide rather than just expect everything to fall from the sky. Moreover, we tell you that is what happened in Serbia. We tell you that in the essence, when Serbia was transferring from the autocratic regimes to the democracy during the end of 90s and the beginning of 200s, we tell you that in that sense, we had a lot of financial and diplomatic help from the West. We tell you that within 5 to 10 years, people realized that not everything will fall from the sky in the sense of money, political education, political decisions. We tell you that now 10 years after that, we can have free elections, we can have opposition who can speak out freely, we can have more freedoms for every single part of the society, regardless of their ethnical or sexual or wherever preferences. We tell you that all those things are crucial for the people, and in that sense, we tell you that it's much better under democracy. Yes?
How can you simply ignore human suffering where your right to stability and not to live in a war-torn nation is more important?
We tell you that nation will still be important under the democracy. We don't necessarily see why that falls. Moreover, we tell you that people suffering already happens in those countries. You haven't proven to us how the people actually move from the suffering on their own and under the regime and under the no idea of stability coming from the OG. Now, second point is, why do we have moral duty? A, West as a developed world and some in countries that have all those rights and freedoms of the people see the people suffering constantly within the autocratic regimes. We tell you that it's crucial for us to recognize those problems and to tackle them sooner than later. Moreover, we tell you that it's not necessarily going to happen on its own, because people are cut off from their rights, people are cut off from the propaganda, and propaganda is the one that controls the country, and it's controlled by the autocrats. So without Western help, it will never happen. Moreover, we tell you that when we try to export democracy, we don't necessarily see why the aftermath is so problematic, because Western countries constantly change policies. So you can stay after the war, you can help them diplomatically, you can help them economically. We don't see a necessity for us to leave. Moreover, we tell you that U.S. foreign policy currently goes into helping all the countries to which they export democracy on a more diplomatic and economic level. Now, why is the democracy good? I've already given you a couple of answers. The final reason I'm going to tell you is that the influence of the West can usually lead to people realizing and being educated more quickly in a sense of how democracy is supposed to look like. In that sense, we tell you that we are more prone to believe that the democratic regime is better option than anything that the OG has presented to you. Moreover, we tell you that when it comes to that and when it comes to the criteria of the OG, what is the best option for the people, we tell you that this is the best option for the people. So for all the reasons, I'm more than proud to oppose. Thank you.
Leader for their speech and welcome the Deputy Prime Minister to take the floor.
As my wonderful Prime Minister already told you, this debate is not about whether democracy is absolutely a superior ideal or superior political regime to begin with compared to these countries. Because we think opening opposition is horrible when it comes to proving whether Western intervention would actually bring democracy to these countries when the country, given that the country is already stable and we have to make a choice between the prioritization of stability and democracy. If you don't prove, and if you can't prove to us that democracy will be definitely brought in these countries, there's no need for you to spend 7 minutes arguing democracy is absolutely better, because we already told you it's highly contextual in this debate. Because we have to debate about what the scenario is likely to be, and this is basically a comparative scenario debate where you have to argue in the end who is doing good for these people, not simply argue up in the air that because democracy is generally good and that's generally what we do in European and American countries, that is also going to be good for them. We basically think they ignored our whole case and have failed to engage at all to my Prime Minister's speech when she gave you extreme possibilities of the West being irresponsible because West is not able to, in the end, reject the domestic political opposition against them in spending so much money in foreign countries and is in the end going to pull out when their interest is over and when their interest is going perverse. We also told you that it is likely to cause extreme turmoil when there is no significant request for democracy in these nations, because just look at what happened even in Arab Spring countries where there was some amount of demand for democracy. Because if you look at how Muslim Brotherhood in the end done an absolute cleansing over an already democratically elected regime, we don't think basically West can do a lot when you simply go in and create a lot of turmoil in these countries. Okay, I think I pretty much dealt with all of their points, but if you still have something to say, yes. Oh, not you, sorry.
Our democracy is just as uncertain as your stability. You also have to engage with this comparative.
I mean, basically, of course, stability, we already told you that we're talking about nations where there is not major political upheaval that already led to civil war and extreme instability to begin with. Because in that case, as our Prime Minister already told you, it is not an exclusivity between intervention and stability that you have to choose from, but in order to achieve stability, you have to intervene. So basically, I don't think you're really understanding the context of this debate in the end. No, sir. Okay, I'm going to talk about 3 things in my speech today after this clarification. First of all, I'm going to talk about stability, what it basically is, because opening opposition wants us to talk about it, although I think our Prime Minister really clearly talked about it. Second, I'm going to talk about whether in the issue of human suffering, because opening opposition seems to want to argue that human suffering already exists in these nations, who is actually increasing human suffering. I'm going to do a comparative here. Lastly, I'm going to talk about what kind of scenario there will be, very likely, in the end in these countries, and how are people likely to react, and how is that even more perverse to the rise of democracy internally in these countries. Okay, first things first, what is stability? First of all, we think Prime Minister already told you about situations like civil war and extreme political struggle, and by saying that, we think we basically told you that by stability, we mean that there is no like major political struggle where like ethnic cleansing is happening, or where like people are really killing each other, and a majority of population is involved in such a crisis, and such an extreme humanitarian crisis doesn't exist. And we think also stability is a situation where people are, yes, having predictable future to begin with like their life ground is happening as they predict, and their life grounds are happening as it has been as they are living. So basically, we think the criteria of stability is extremely clear in this debate, and we have given you a lot of examples on what countries are stable and what countries are actually unstable. Okay, I think basically the question here is this: because the opening opposition wants to argue that people inside these nations really want democracy, but simply cannot shout out for democracy, basically because like their media is controlled and people are brainwashed, whatnot. First of all, we think first of all it is extremely not factual to begin with. Like if you look at countries like Iran where there is theocracy, where religious identity is extremely linked to politics, you can't simply argue that these people really want democracy over like, you know, their Khomeini, because sorry, I forgot the name, like Khomeini, because basically, simply because you think they would want democracy over this. But moreover, we think basically, even if we do engage in your case scenario, that these people do want democracy, but are simply like not really thinking about like they would want democracy, but simply are being struck with like media control and government regulations so that they're not able to really speak out about this, we think you do worse to these people who haven't really thought about democracy before. Because because you're talking about people who are already brainwashed and who are not really having an extremely more problem compared to them being put in war-torn situations. We think even in your best case scenario, even if we do admit that democracy might be better for these people, we think if stability is not given, we think you infringe on more basic needs and more basic rights to begin with. No, sir. Let's move on to the second issue of human suffering. We think basically what you're trying to say here is that human suffering already exists in these nations. We do admit that human suffering sometimes might exist, but we're worried about comparatively giving more human suffering, so we think you lose out on that point. No, sir. I don't have time, sorry. Moving on to the third and final issue I'm going to deal with in my speech today, which is extremely important as it's a unique contribution. I'm going to talk about what Western intervention would usually do in these countries as it creates turmoil. We already told you that basically, when you intervene as West country and you're likely to be very irresponsible, we told you basically why there is higher possibility that there will be turmoil. What we want to say here is that if civil war occurs and if struggle and conflict occurs, we think people are likely to grow more anti-sentiment against the West and more anti-sentiment against liberal democracy. And we think that's extremely perverse against their own want and their own demand for democracy in the end, because we think people are more likely to rely on things like extreme religious ideas or extreme terrorist ideas against the West and against Western liberal democracy. And I don't think it is generally good in making these people believe that maybe Western liberal democracy is something, a good thing that I want to model and I want to want in the future, basically. So I think it rather hinders these people wanting democracy for their future in the end. It rather makes them not want this, but rather move on to other war-torn situations or more conflicting situations. We think basically we gave you enough of counterfactual when we told you that in situations like Tunisia, how that's the most successful case of Arab Spring, when they did admit that there is a trade-off between stability and democracy for a short term, but they did move more towards guaranteeing more rights for these people and move a step further towards democracy because they were able to make this trade-off. So we basically think if you don't give stability to these people are not likely to opt into your narrative of liking Western liberal democracy. These people are not likely to opt into believing that democracy is something they want in the end. We think basically it's perverse and you're doing worse. For these reasons, we're extremely proud to propose.
Welcome the Deputy Opposition Leader to continue their bench's case.
when Assad was in 2014 asked how long does he plan to stay in Syria as their supreme leader, he answered, as long as people of Syria support me. So the next question was how he knows that people of Syria support him. He said, you know, I feel that in my heart. So we say, fuck you, Assad. We want to make the people choose who is going to govern them. Firstly, the assumption Assad government makes that people do not want democracy is simply completely false. So we simply do not know how these people, whether these people want or do not want democracy. It's simply extremely hard to find these mechanisms. So we do not realize why is benefit of the doubt in this situation due averse to risk more important than reacting. Secondly, even if we concede that they, at the status quo, want to stay in this kind of regimes, we say that they're really deprived from them free choice because they had not had the possibility to choose or to see whether which system is going to be better or not. But thirdly, we say that democracy is the system which is going to implement you a right to choose who is going to govern you and right to choose who is going to deprive you from certain rights and who is going to give certain rights back. Thirdly, even if they do not want it, they're still under the great pressure of it. Secondly, if their side is trying to put us a burden that this is necessarily going to happen through war, we say that is not true. You can do it through Western propaganda, you can do it through economic and development aid, you can do it through humanitarian aid, you can do it to peaceful talks to other different leaders. Note the examples of Romania, of former Yugoslav republics, of other former Soviet republics. War is not the necessary measure to do these kind of things, which means that the vast majority of their harms, suffering of the people doesn't stand in this debate. But secondly, even when intervention happens, side government has advantage because they can see the bad things of the intervention. What is the problematic is that you do not see what would happen if the intervention would not happen. And we have seen what would happen in Rwanda. Now, why we believe that autocratic regimes are going to be more prone to have more war crimes, to have more wars, and to, on long term, bring more instability. Firstly, you build cult of a leader, which means that the vast majority of people in the country support this guy. Secondly, you have the propaganda. These two things mean that there is no any kind of accountability inside of this country about what these people is going to do. Thirdly, usually the leaders of these countries come from certain military structures, which means that they probably have the part of their identity is quite war-prone because they usually gain their power through the other civil wars, and that is another way of how they regain power in the people. Which means that without this kind of accountability and with these psychological structures of these leaders, we have the great chance that they're going to have more wars, they're going to have a lot more war crimes. So yes, even if we concede that intervention sometimes that intervention sometimes also brings this kind of suffering. We see that we have that on both sides of the house. They never explain why intervention necessarily brings this, but we tell you why this leader necessarily brings this. But note the next comparative. We believe that even if you impose democracy, you're probably going to have Western allies, you're probably going to have this kind of humanitarian aid, which is going to help you to get more accountable once the democratic regime starts to establish. Secondly, why we believe that economy is going to be better in the long term due to democratic regimes, regardless of how they are. Firstly, we believe that autocratic regimes are more prone to corruption. Secondly, we believe that the power structures inside of culture are quite oligarchic, which means that a lot amount of money which exists in this country is going to trickle down only to small amount of people. Thirdly, we believe that it is not very likely that investments from the West are going to come into these countries if they do not have any kind of democracy because of great amount of instability and unpredictability regarding which people rule this country. But thirdly, we tell you that democratic regimes usually have greater cooperation with other countries, even though democracy is unstable, which means that you're going to have a lot of more international trade and this kind of stuff. Lastly, they call out us that there is no mechanism how the democracy is going to be implemented. We tell you, in some occasions it is probably not. These are circumstances we're probably not going to intervene as soon as possible. But as long as we have a certain sign that there is a possibility of democracy to be implemented, we believe that we are going to do that. Firstly, because people are usually pissed off. People usually get pissed off on their regime. Secondly, because these people usually make a vast amount of war crimes. Note examples about Saddam Hussein, note examples about Gaddafi. Everything we're talking about is the problems which happened during the wars. Nobody talks about the war crimes they committed. And more importantly, nobody talks about war crimes and shit that would happen if these people would stay, if these people would stay into the power. Before my last point, POI, opening.
The motion states which one you're going to choose between stability and democracy. You have to talk about a situation where you have to sacrifice stability over democracy at the expense of the human suffering.
We tell you that we are going to sacrifice what you perceive as stability, which means autocratic regimes having a lot of power deciding what to do with their people or not. So even if it does produce short-term harms, we are going to tell why democracy are bringing a long-term stability. But secondly, our burden is not to say that now we are going to enter into North Korea just because now they are not democratic regimes. It would be totally absurd to put this burden on the side government. Lastly, why we believe West has a moral duty to do so. We say that many of these countries are in shitty situations due to exploitation the West has had to them toward past 100 or 200 years, which means that they did not have a certain time, they did not have economic power to develop and to reach this level of political culture the West has reached already. For all these reasons, we see that these countries have usually been deprived from their right to democracy, which we all agree that on an absolute scale is better than autocracy. That we believe it would be extremely hypocritical and immoral for the Western countries to ignore this kind of suffering these people are having every day. Note, Mussolini's Italy was a stable country. Hitler's Germany was a stable country. North Korea is a stable country. It does not mean that we should support them, regardless of any cost side government is trying to put on our burden. Very proud to oppose.
I thank the Deputy Opposition Leader and all the speakers in the opening half. I welcome the government member to continue that bench's case.
Some responses to opening opposition. They say, oh, democracy is so great. But of course we agree that democracy is great. The question is, how do you get to democracy in the long run? And the question is, should you sacrifice, like in the short run, stability on the way? And we think that is more likely to not lead to democracy and to likely make the creation of a working democracy harder in the long run. And we think they completely forgot that might be a problem in their case, okay? Then they say, oh, but we don't need interventions or anything to push for democracy. But the motion clearly says that we are sacrificing sacrificing stability. And that obviously means that to a certain extent we are destabilizing these regions. Like you have to acknowledge the meaning of these particular words, right? So the problem with OO is that they essentially gave us no mechanism for why their created democracies actually lead to stability and prosperity. We think they're just going to create some form of cycle of democracies, dictatorships, democracies where people like drive into more and more poverty. And we think that's not really what this what on the well-being metric of this debate should win this debate. And just like to answer the question in the beginning of closing opposition, what about the sanctions against Putin? Well, we're doing them for stability, right? We did not want him interfering in the Crimea. We did not want him destabilizing these regions because we believe that leads to less prosperity, that leads to less well-being. We think that is the problem. That's the reason why we did this. Okay, so well-being is the metric. First thing first, short-term well-being. They also have to deal with the short-term well-being. And what happens if you destabilize a region? If you introduce some form of, I don't know, if you help revolutionary groups, if you introduce some form of revolution, what you do is you create revolution, you create civil war, you create chaos. We think that is way more shitty in the short run than not having a free press and no vote. And you need to engage with that. We think just on the short-term well-being metric for the next, let's say, 10 years, 20 years, we win. So you essentially ruin the lives of a whole generation. That is a huge moral problem, and you need to think about whether you really want to do it. We think for most of the people who are involved in these specific cases, they probably would choose in a different way. They probably would not waste their generation of a life away for the greater good of democracy. They would much more rather say, I would rather live in a stable society, in a prosperous society, even if I cannot vote, even if I am slightly oppressed. We think we are not talking about cases of Rwanda here, where there are obvious humanitarian catastrophes. Of course we are going to intervene there. We are not going to intervene just for the sake of bringing democracy, as long as these people are reasonably well off. You have to deal with the freaking motion, okay? So what we're saying is the people in these countries would likely not consent. They would make a different decision. They would more likely say, we value prosperity more, especially since like the value of democracy is something that we might have here in Europe on a very like high developmental level, but we think it's actually derived from like this, the fact that we can care about self-actualization and actualizing ourselves like in the political sphere as well. We think people in less developed countries don't have this to the same extent. They don't value it that highly. We think you're making a wrong moral judgment about what they want. You're pushing them into suffering. We think that is not okay. Now on the long run, what we're saying is the instability that you're introducing leads to, in the long run, less well-being. That's like a fact. And to a lesser chance of developing a working democracy. Why is that? Well, what you're going to do with your instability, you're very likely going to introduce political instability, civil war or revolution, or economic instability, making these people very poor by trade embargoes or something. And then you gave us the example of Assad, and I thought that was glorious. Yeah, what did you do there with Assad, with pushing the rebels? Yeah, you destabilized the whole region. We have a refugee catastrophe right now in the whole freaking world. Yeah, even in Europe, you have managed to even destabilize Europe to a certain extent. Think about that. Imagine that. It's insane, right? So what you have to acknowledge is that these effects in many cases spill over. They spill over to other countries. Refugees get there, and all the negative effects that I'm going to talk about are not centered on one country, but they are applicable to all the others that you're pouring into despair in that way. So the first point that we make is that what you're doing, like the chaos and disability, it removes institutions necessary for prosperity. What does that mean? Like these institutions are not necessarily democratic institutions. Like, I don't know, courts, property rights, like the ability for reasonable trade. These things are necessary for democracy, but we think you're to a large extent destroying them by putting these countries in the prolonged state of revolution. They have already talked about for why that might take a while to settle in any reasonable way. We think, take for example the monopoly of power. What you're having is, I don't know, maybe a coup, maybe a people's revolution. You have a distribution of weapons to like huge amounts of people. It's very difficult to regain a monopoly of power. We think that leads in the long run to way more chaos, to high difficulties with destabilizing this region. We think all these things lead to significantly less well-being, and we think we have a moral duty to uphold the well-being of these people amongst everything else. So what we're saying is next is I should put the paper here, right? That in general. The democracies that you're going to create won't last. You're going to get into some cycle of democracies and dictatorships. A great example is Egypt, for example.
So
Exactly that happened, yeah? You destabilize the region, you got your short-term democracy, and then the next dictatorship. In Afghanistan, the Taliban are on the rise again. Why is that? Okay, what you've created is a poor, chaotic country in which people vote. But just voting does not make you a democracy, yeah? A democracy is when you have a stable situation in which, like, a reasonable transfer of power, for example, after an opposition gets the vote, is actually possible. We think that is something that you are very likely not creating once you have eroded the stability. In these poor countries, it's very likely that, for example, like the people, the overall people cannot counterbalance the government that they have just voted into office, and it's very likely that you're just going to get the next dictatorship. You're very likely not going to be able to counterbalance the multi-ethnic problems that you have in your society, and then, like, once you have voted, one of the ethnicities feels disenfranchised, and you just get into the cycle all over again. We had this, for example, in Germany on the lower level when Hitler came to power. Great example again from side opposition, where you had like a huge economic turmoil. What happened was that people voted extreme parties, and what happened then was like shit. We think these things, yeah, are something that we should try to avoid. We should try to avoid refugee crises. We should try to avoid making the world a more shitty place. We think a better way is some form of institutional shift to power sharing. We think we're getting that by making people more prosperous, by getting them to trade, by getting them to educate themselves, by actually having time to work. I think in a more prosperous world, it's more likely that sooner or later, like, the middle class is going to ask for concessions, for more power sharing, and we think by that mechanism, sooner or later, something like democracy is going to creep in. We think that is viable in the long run. We think that upholds the well-being of the people in the long run. We think, therefore, you should vote closing government.
We think there's an inherent contradiction on all sides of the government. The thing they mainly fear is the fact that if we instabilize a regime, then oh no, maybe it'll turn out to be a dictatorship in the end, or maybe a non-democratic regime. We think that in the end what they want is democracy, and this is an inherent tension in their case. Second of all, we think that they're going on this wrong presumption. We think that the presumption of the motion essentially goes on to say that if we can unstabilize a whole dictatorial regime, essentially we can promote democracy towards a reasonable level. We don't think that Assad is a good example of like where we put someone there and then we couldn't do anything about it. Okay. So, let's talk a little bit about opening government, then about closing government, then I'm going to tell you about how we achieve progress through this creation of instability and promotion of democracy. Because again, the presumption of the motion is that we can promote democracy in a meaningful way there. It's not like they can promote the infinite stability, but we can do like mainly, we don't know if there's going to be a democratic regime there. Okay, so, opening government tells us that it's going to be harder for Western intervention. We're saying that's going to lead to civil war. Well, we don't think that's true. We promoted stability in Syria, and that led to the civil war that's not unending. But in Tunisia, where we promoted democracy, that ended up better. So we think that's okay. We also want to talk about the perverse incentive. Well, we say that the lack of stability there, it's going to that they're saying that because the lack of the stability is going to destroy the economy. Well, first of all, we don't think that the states that we're talking about in this motion look mainly like Libya. We think they look more like the Ukraine, where we promoted instability in the fact that they were not going to help, not going to leave you under Russia's control or Russia's sphere of influence. We're going to fight, we're going to come to the Euromaidan, and essentially bring politicians there, help you guys try to promote instability in your country to the detriment of where you lose Crimea and you have a little bit of turmoil in eastern Ukraine, but the rest of the country is doing better after a couple of years. Okay. Second, let's also talk a lot about this thing about Putin, which both sides tackled. We're saying that yes, we are promoting economical sanctions on Putin in order to stabilize them, in order to unstabilize him and essentially give power to the liberal politicians in Russia in order to get him away from power from Putin. Also, this idea about, and also going on to closing government, they're saying that we're destabilizing entire regimes, but we don't know what's going to happen. Well, we're saying again that the presumption is that we are going to be able to do some form of real democracy there. Second of all, the moral problem, well, we think there's a lot more of a moral problem if we as Western governments that promote human rights and promote all of these kinds of things like freedom of choice go on to say that, okay, yeah, but that's not maybe for you. Maybe like in 20 years or so when maybe you're going to be like something else. We don't think this is how we should go about these things. We think that our moral responsibility is first of all to promote our own values in order to create a better world even for us. And also about this idea that in the long run, and the whole thing about Assad being a bad example. Well, we think that this whole Assad thing was coming. We stabilized his regime to the point where we couldn't do it anymore, and because Syria was essentially the only place in the Arab Spring that we didn't help out in order to promote democracy, because we favored stability for the Assad regime. And then ISIS came along, and oh well, now it's horrible there. And yes, we've unstabilized Europe, but we've unstabilized Europe because we refused to destabilize Assad at the right moment in order to create a slightly democratic regime that wouldn't have turned Syria into a civil war zone that ISIS could easily exploit. Opening.
So what good did America do in the growth of ISIS or preventing growth of ISIS because America pulled out from Middle East, ISIS extremely increased their power?
Okay, thanks. We're not here to defend America, right? We're here to defend the Western policy as a foreign thing in total. We do accept that America has done some bad things in the world, but we think that we have a ton of other examples like Romania, like Serbia, like the Ukraine, and all of the other examples that are not in current civil war and complete civil unrest, like you were saying. And therefore, we think those are the kind of countries that we're talking about. So we're going to tell you a little bit of a story, because the thing is that the government is trying to sell you the idea that stability is the PC term for we're gonna entrench a favorable, we'll let you exploit our local people or our local resources regime. This is the kind of world that they want to live in. And we're gonna tell you a little bit about what happened in Romania and back in the communist period, because essentially what happened there was that the Western Europes gave a lot of money to Ceausescu, to our dictator, and then entrenched him in his power. Therefore, what happened was that after all, he tried paying them back, and paid them back on the backs and by sending them the food and the clothes of the Romanian population, therefore creating much more suffering than was in the communist period in Romania before the state gave them any kind of money. And what this instability that was created by this, without the West's fault, essentially, without the West wanting this to happen, was that it created the only forceful revolution, the only violent revolution in Europe that was horribly unstable, and Romania was horribly unstable a couple of years afterwards. But now, after 20-something years, we're in the European Union, and we can come to Greece passing through Macedonia without a passport. We think that's a major amount of success. We think this is the kind of thing that we stand for today. This is exactly the kind of thing we did with Ukraine. This is the kind of thing we're doing with the neighborhood policy that European Union has with all of the countries that are neighboring the European Union. Because realistically speaking, they want democracy, we want democracy. Why not just go to it directly? Because speaking of which, if we entrench a regime that the local governments don't like, then those people, when they do get their freedom, and they will, because this tends to happen, like there's nowhere in the world that this hasn't happened yet, or it doesn't want it to start happening. And therefore, because people at some point, they are most likely going to get their freedom, we want them to be on our side. We want them at the end of the day, when they finish their struggle, not to go like Iran toward a theocratical regime. We want them to come to a democratic regime, so they can help us with things like the refugee crisis. So they can help us with things like entrenching international laws like human rights. We want these things for these countries and for our countries, because essentially a more democratic world is a more peaceful and more safe world, because democratic countries just don't fight each other. This literally hasn't happened at all in history. And because of peace, because of human rights, and because stability is overrated and it's just a politically correct word for the will let us exploit your locals regime, we beg you to oppose. Thanks.
I thank the opposition member for their speech and welcome the government whip to conclude their bench's case.
Okay. First, let me deal with a few ideas that I feel are left over from side government, and then I'll explain why closing opposition gave you the best mechanisms for why we think that stability is always what? Oh, a government. All right. We're closing government gave you the best reasons for why we think that there's actually a mechanism behind why stability is always a necessary prerequisite for actually building working and functioning democracies. And therefore, on the comparative of should we go for stability first or for democracy first, when we have a choice or like a situation where we can only choose one of the two, we should always go for stability first, right? What is sort of left over from opening? We think they had this idea that that dictatorships and these governments that somehow needed democracy are always work against their people. There's always genocide and so on, with the example of the Iraq. But what we say is that the wars that we had later, while cost a lot more casualties than all of the regime ever caused. Right? Yes, there were gas attacks, but just the head count of how many people died in the war, how many civilian casualties there were in the Iraq war, outnumbers the amount of like political prisoners and political victims of the regime that preceded that by a huge number, and therefore saying that this is so extremely bad is probably not true. And additionally, obviously, this is also some sort of instability. You can't just say that North Korea is a very stable state to the degree that probably if you live in North Korea, you don't feel that your life is very stable when you have to fear going to work like prison camps, when you cannot really have like property, when you cannot express your opinions, when you sometimes cannot even own your own clothing, but have to like get that from the government. Like stuff like that is probably not very stable. When we talk about stability, we always obviously mean that there's some sort of future that you can see yourself in, that there's some sort of stability in your life, that you have some sort of property rights and other rights. You just cannot vote, but rather there's a dictator that wants this. And obviously, this dictator is interested in stability as well, because he can only extract the resources that he really likes from his population if there's a certain degree of stability. He might not want his population to develop as fast as it does develop maybe under like a working democracy. But we say that in a working democracy is not very likely, right? So what we get is them telling us how great working democracies are, and then they say, if we have a working democracy, then it will just work out. But what they don't give us is actually a metric for stability. And they realize that they need stability because they say, oh, we can just stay for a very long time, right? So therefore they say, oh, we recognize that stability is essential for this working, and we will give them stability by staying for a very long time, right? Firstly, therefore, they notice that stability is necessary for actually making this democracy work. And secondly, we think that this is not often the case, right? Often we go out of these countries before we've actually solved this, right? We can see this in Afghanistan, where we're going out before we've actually created enough stability for the democracy there to actually meaningfully hold itself up, right? We see that we have no more political will in the West, and you cannot to stay there. And we have the Taliban's on the rise, taking more land, being the biggest economic factor in that region, like selling drugs and growing drugs. And we say that you cannot just make up us staying there until there is stability. At this point, you're saying that we already need stability, and if we have stability, yes, democracy is maybe an option, but where do you get that stability from? And you haven't explained how that stability just comes out of democracy, like magically, right? And then we get an extension that is basically examples, so I will deal with every example, right? Firstly, Tunisia. That was the only country in the Arab Spring where we didn't significantly intervene from the West, where the population itself really wanted democracy and we did not really go in. Then you had the Ukraine. I'm not sure that the people of Ukraine would have said, oh, we want democracy so much we're willing to give up the Crimea and half of our country. But you say they're doing so fine now. Probably in their own metric, they did not want this outcome, right? If we ask the people, and Mark has made that clear, oftentimes people want stability over democracy. And when they have a certain degree of stability, then they want to vote. Because then they have an idea what it means to make meaningful decisions for their life and about their life, right? We see that in Afghanistan, where people don't have this idea, and therefore often just simply vote on what is the Stamm? On their tribal affiliations, where the tribal leaders tell them, you have to vote in this kind or that kind, because they don't have this idea of democracy there. We just don't say that works. And then you say that we somehow are responsible for Syria, and we somehow didn't help there. But the problem was that because we have this idea of Western interventionism creating democracy, they expected us to help, and then we didn't help. So clearly, them expecting us to help is somehow our fault as well, and we say that we haven't done a good job of actually then doing anything about it because there is limited political capital in the West. Taking opening.
Yeah. So, we're giving an analysis of why are autocratic regimes inherently linked to more war and more war crimes. How do you deal with that point?
Well, we're sacrificing it for probably more instability, right? And I've told you that these governments want a certain degree of stability. Yes, there's probably some crimes within the country, but recognize that there's a lot more casualties in the Afghanistan war, civilian casualties. There have been a lot more civilian casualties in Iraq. There have been huge casualties in Syria, much more than Assad could ever account for within all of his of him being in power. So that's just not a good comparative you're engaging in there, right? And then lastly, there was Romania, where you said this just tends to happen, no mechanism whatsoever. So we're left with them saying that somehow we magically get stability, and we just say that doesn't happen. What have we given you? We've shown you that there were a lot of examples where democracies were unstable, and destabilized democracies lead to dictatorships, and that is a huge problem for the West, right? We have in Egypt we don't have a democracy anymore. We have a new military dictatorship. We had Germany, where economic destability led to probably the worst dictatorship we've ever seen on the face of Earth. We say that in a situation where you choose one over the other, we need stability first. And when people recognize that they have certain rights and they have these certain things, then we can maybe have democracy without sacrificing these other things, right? It's always a push for rights first before we push for democracy. That is what the people in these countries want, and we gave you the mechanism for how this will actually work by pushing for rights, right? We say that us pushing for rights will be more accepted by these governments. Us pushing for rights and stability and therefore prosperity will be more accepted by dictatorships, and therefore is more likely to lead to better outcomes for the people in those countries, and therefore very proud to propose.
the whole conflict between Russia and Ukraine started because of the fact that Ukrainians wanted so badly to be more towards European Union that they changed the government. Then they started having protests. Then they moved from the influence of Russia towards the EU. And then Russia said, okay, you know what? We'll make a stance. We'll show you that we're powerful. But Ukraine stated that no, even if you take our land, even if you kill our boys, we still believe in democratic values more than we believe in stability. Because in that stability, we don't have rights. Rights for which the closing government is so badly fighting for. Because in that stability, we do not have freedom. We do not have free market. We do not have anything that we wish. Because the government accepted the fact that democracy is more than just a voting system. Democracy is also human rights. Democracy is also freedom of speech. Democracy is a better life in within. And we today, on the side of the opposition, we are strong to affirm that we believe that it is better to kill some for the benefit of the many, especially when those ones who are going to die are the ones who also wish for that things and are ready to sacrifice their lives for that. And we believe that in order to reach stability, you have to have democracy. As the closing government stated, that stability is when people are pleased to have rights and things we need and things like that. This is a clear state from the closing government. And this is what we actually have in democracy. So this is why we believe that in order to reach stability, we need to have democracy. And for these reasons, we need to prioritize democracy in front of stability. No, thank you. Then, I'm going to answer two questions. First of all, is doing this in countries with bad regime going to make the world better? And if for the countries which are not so bad or don't have an authoritarian regime is going to be better? For the first time, we believe that even in countries who have authoritarian regime, it's better to actually export democracy instead of stability because of the opportunity. Right now, we see countries who already find themselves in an instabilized situation. So instead of just going and put Assad back in its position to torture people on and on and on again for those perverse motives that the government, the first bench talked about, like gas and petrol, which USA, by the way, and Europe had very close relation with Assad and with Gaddafi for selling to them like cheap gas and cheap petrol for those perverse motives. Now we believe that we should give up and actually go and export democracy. And export democracy because it's opportune, because we don't no longer have those regimes that attack human rights, and people are all open. Are all again open to our democracy, and they are looking for guidance towards democracy. So it's our duty to go there and export democracy, and that is part of the extension of my opposition, with which the closing government has never talked about. Don't you agree? Opening.
First, Crimea has an age-long problem of separatist movement, so it's hard to call it stable. But second, how can you guarantee freedom of speech when you cannot guarantee safe and predictable future within your ordinary life?
First of all, we have given multiple examples in which democracy has gained to stability, but they have never managed to show the other way around. Situation when we put pressure on stability, and that made a better world for everyone, or for a better democracy. Secondly, what we are telling you is that when you are going to have democracy, which I already explained that it means a lot more than just a voting system, you are going to actually make sure that people are going to have what they want. And when people have what they want, people are more inclined to actually live in a stable society. Because we have civil wars, we have revolutions in the moment when people are not pleased with their situation. Because Romania looked stable until December 8, 1989, but was actually a bomb under pressure which was waiting to explode. And when it exploded, it went so badly because we didn't have democratic values before, because nobody exported to us democratic values, so that when we decided to have democracy, to actually know what to do with them. And that's why other countries like Germany or other countries like Poland did a lot better than Romania in the first years. But never mind. But going to further. Because when you, moreover, why we believe it's better for this country is because when those regimes like Assad or Gaddafi are going to lose power, they will lose their way, and at that moment, And at that moment, we are going to lose our international relationships with those countries, and even the small control that we had upon those countries. Another extension to which the closing government never tackled about. Because what will happen is that at this moment we have really good relationships with South Africa, and we are putting pressure on them to actually respect women and respect lesbians, to give them more rights and stop raping them, you know? And because of the international relationships that we have with South Africa, and because of the international democracy values that we have implemented in South Africa, and our courses that implement less discrimination and so on and so forth, South Africa in the end agreed to the fact that raping lesbians will not make them less lesbians, and it's actually bad and we should stop it. Because promoting democracy or democracy values doesn't mean only to change the regime. It's also meaning that in countries that already have a democracy statute, you are perpetuating the democracy's ideas of freedom of speech, women rights, etc., minority rights, etc., etc. And that's why at this moment the European Union has the neighborhood policy, which makes sure that all the countries within the borders of the European Union, which are by the way democratic, are going to adhere to the democratic values and are going to promote democratic values even more, so that they would have a chance to actually enter the European Union, which the European Union is actually the way to stability and the way to stability, and you reach stability through democracy. And that leads me to my second point of the discourse, for the countries that are not in such a bad situation, and for them it is better to promote this kind of techniques because it promotes a better dialogue. And my colleagues explained to you how it makes international relationships better, because democratic countries never fight within each other. Again, a point to which the closing government never answered. Then again, it promotes human rights respect, and by promoting human rights respect, you are making sure actually that you are going to have a more stable situation, because people can take only that much. At the moment when they can no longer be killed and suffered and tortured and whatever, at that moment it's when you are going to have revolutions. But if you have human rights respect, you are going to have a more stable country. And for all these reasons, because it's better for us, it's better for those countries, and it's better for everyone, please save the world and propose the motion.